I let something into our dimension. I have always found airports unsettling. The constant hum of engines, the hurried crowds, and the sterile, fluorescent lighting combined to create a place that felt both transient and endless. I had spent the last 2 hours wandering aimlessly through the terminal, waiting for my delayed flight to board. The delay announcement had crackled over the loudspeakers, and an apathetic voice had informed us that our departure would be postponed by another 2 hours. With nothing better to do, I explored the vast terminal. I passed by countless shops, each with garish displays trying to catch the attention of weary travelers. Duty-free stores promised deals on everything from perfumes to electronics, their bright lights a stark contrast to the dimness of the terminal. I bought a coffee from a small cafe, the barista barely making eye contact as she handed me my cup. I found a seat near a large window, watching the planes take off and land in a steady rhythm. The longer I sat, the more restless I became. My stomach churned with anxiety and too much caffeine, and I decided I needed to find a restroom. The airport signage led me to a secluded part of the terminal, down a deserted corridor with a single, flickering light. At the end of the hallway was an old, discolored door with a tarnished brass sign that read, "Restroom." I hesitated, but my need was too pressing to ignore. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The restroom was eerily silent. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The tiles were cracked and covered in grime, and the mirrors were so dirty they barely reflected my image. A shiver ran down my spine, but I chalked it up to my imagination and the unnerving atmosphere of the place. I quickly found a stall, locked the door, and sat down, trying to hurry through my business. As I sat there, I heard a faint whispering. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or the ventilation, but the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like multiple voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones, but I couldn't make out the words. Panic started to creep in. I finished as quickly as I could, flushed, and stepped out of the stall. The whispering stopped abruptly. Washing my hands, I noticed something strange in the mirror. The reflection seemed to waver, the background shifting subtly. Leaning closer, I tried to get a better look, but the grime obscured any clear view. Shaking off the feeling, I dried my hands and exited the restroom. As soon as I stepped back into the corridor, something felt off. The hallway was different, darker, with a damp chill that hadn't been there before. The flickering light had gone out entirely. I hurried back towards the terminal, but the corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls closing in tighter with every step. Finally, I burst into the main terminal, but it wasn't the same. The bustling crowds were gone, replaced by a desolate, dimly lit space. The electronic flight boards displayed unintelligible symbols, and the loudspeakers emitted a low, droning hum. Panic surged through me as I realized that all the shops and gates were empty, devoid of any signs of life. I ran towards the information desk, hoping to find someone, anyone, to explain what was happening. But the desk was abandoned, the computer screens showing only static. I picked up a courtesy phone, but there was no dial tone, just the same eerie hum. Desperation drove me to search every corner of the terminal, but I found nothing. No people, no exits, just endless rows of empty chairs and silent, closed-off corridors. The whispering began again, surrounding me, echoing off the walls. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow darted behind a pillar. I ran towards it, calling out, but there was no answer. As I rounded the corner, I came face to face with my own reflection in a large, cracked mirror mounted on the wall. But it wasn't my reflection, at least not exactly. The figure in the mirror stared back with hollow, lifeless eyes, a twisted grin spreading across its face. The reflection raised a hand and pointed towards the restroom I had exited earlier. I turned to look, and there it was, the same discolored door, standing ajar, a dim light flickering inside. I felt a strange compulsion to return, as if the answer to my predicament lay within. I walked back down the hallway, my steps echoing in the silence. The whispers grew louder, now forming coherent words. Come back. Come back. I reached the door and stepped inside, finding the restroom exactly as I had left it. But now the air was colder, the smell of decay more overpowering. In the mirror, my reflection stood waiting, grinning malevolently. You shouldn't have left, it whispered. Now you'll never leave. A cold hand clamped down on my shoulder, and I spun around to see nothing but darkness. The door slammed shut, and the light flickered out, leaving me in complete darkness. The whispers surrounded me, consuming me, until all I could do was scream. When I finally regained consciousness, I found myself sprawled on the floor of the restroom. The air felt different, fresher, but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. I shakily got to my feet and stumbled out of the restroom, half expecting to find the eerie, desolate terminal I had seen before. But the terminal was back to normal. Crowds of people bustled about. The flight boards displayed clear, understandable information, and the loudspeakers announced arrivals and departures. I let out a sigh of relief, convinced that whatever I had experienced was just a vivid, terrifying nightmare. I hurried through the terminal, eager to get to my gate and leave this unsettling experience behind. But as I moved through the crowds, I began to notice things that were off. Subtle at first. People's clothes seemed slightly outdated, their expressions blank, almost robotic. Then, more bizarre. I saw a dog walking a human on a leash. The dog, wearing a suit and tie, held the leash in its mouth, while the human crawled on all fours, obediently following. I blinked, thinking I must be hallucinating, but the scene persisted. I looked around, noticing more oddities. A group of people were seated in a circle, silently passing an invisible object from one to the other, their eyes glazed over. A man with a newspaper had two faces, one on the front of his head and another on the back, both reading different sections simultaneously. Feeling a growing sense of dread, I approached a security guard to ask for help. But as I got closer, I realized the guard was a mannequin, perfectly still and lifelike, but made of plastic. Its eyes followed me as I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. I decided to leave the airport entirely, convinced that I needed fresh air and a clear head. Exiting through the main doors, I stepped outside into what should have been a busy city street. Instead, I found a scene straight out of a nightmare. The sky was a deep, unnatural shade of red, and the buildings seemed to pulse with a life of their own, breathing in and out like giant lungs. Cars hovered a few feet off the ground, emitting a low, throbbing hum as they moved slowly along the street. People floated above the sidewalks, their bodies limp, as if suspended by invisible strings. I stumbled down the street, my mind reeling. Every shop window I passed reflected a distorted version of myself, each reflection more grotesque and twisted than the last. I saw children playing with invisible toys, their laughter echoing unnaturally, mixing with the whispers that still filled my ears. Desperate for some semblance of normalcy, I ducked into a cafe, hoping to find refuge. Inside, the scene was no better. The patrons sat at tables, staring blankly at plates of food that constantly shifted form. One moment a steak, the next a writhing mass of worms. The barista behind the counter had no eyes, just smooth skin where they should have been, yet she moved about as if she could see perfectly. I backed out of the cafe, the whispers growing louder, the world around me warping and twisting. I felt as if I was on the verge of losing my mind. Then I saw it, a familiar figure standing across the street. It was me, but not me. My doppelganger, the twisted reflection from the mirror, stood there, grinning. It beckoned to me, and despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I felt compelled to follow. I crossed the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar as I reached the figure. It reached out, its cold hand touching mine, and everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor of the airport restroom, the normal, bustling terminal outside the door. My heart raced as I got up and quickly exited the restroom, scanning the terminal for any signs of the bizarre world I had just experienced. Everything was normal. The flight boards, the people, the sounds, all perfectly mundane. I stumbled to my gate, boarded my flight, and collapsed into my seat, exhausted and terrified. As the plane took off, I glanced out the window. For a split second, I saw my reflection in the glass, hollow, lifeless eyes staring back at me, a twisted grin spreading across my face. I closed my eyes, willing the image away, hoping that when I opened them, I would be back in the real world. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The vividness of my experience, the visceral fear I felt, it couldn't all be a dream. Determined to shake off the feeling, I tried to distract myself, watching the in-flight movie, listening to music, anything to keep my mind occupied. But every so often, I would catch a glimpse of my reflection in the window or a darkened screen, and the image of those hollow eyes and that twisted grin would flash back at me. When the plane finally landed, I disembarked quickly, eager to get home and leave the entire ordeal behind. As I walked through the terminal, everything seemed normal, yet an unsettling sense of déjà vu lingered. I collected my luggage and called a cab, my eyes darting around for any sign of the otherworldly disturbances I had witnessed. The cab ride home was uneventful, and I began to relax as the familiar sights of my neighborhood came into view. I paid the driver and stepped out, breathing in the fresh air, relieved to be back. I hurried up to my apartment, unlocking the door and stepping inside. Everything was just as I had left it. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything was truly back to normal. I showered and changed into fresh clothes, trying to wash away the lingering unease. Just as I settled onto the couch, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my best friend, Mark. "Hey man, where were you last night? You missed the party." I frowned, texting back quickly. "What party?" "Don't mess with me. You were there, remember? You left early, said you weren't feeling well." A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't been to any party. As I typed out a response, a sudden noise made me jump. It was coming from the hallway outside my apartment. Slowly, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. To my horror, I saw myself standing there, staring back at me with that same twisted grin. My doppelganger was here, in my world, trying to take over my life. I stepped back, heart racing, as the door handle began to turn. I knew I couldn't let it in. Thinking quickly, I ran to the back door of my apartment, slipping out quietly and heading down the fire escape. I needed to find a way back to the airport, back to the restroom where this nightmare had begun. Navigating the streets, I hailed a cab, urging the driver to get me to the airport as fast as possible. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. It seemed my doppelganger had crossed over when I did, and now it was trying to replace me in my own world. The airport loomed into view, and I threw some bills at the driver, not waiting for change. I rushed through the terminal, ignoring the confused stares of passers-by. I found the same secluded corridor and the discolored restroom door. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The restroom was just as grim and decayed as before, the air thick with the same smell of mold. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I approached the mirror, seeing my doppelganger already there, waiting. It stepped out of the mirror, facing me with that twisted grin. "You should have stayed," it hissed. "Now, it's too late." I felt a surge of anger and fear. "You're not taking my life," I shouted, charging at it. We collided, our bodies grappling for dominance. It was like fighting a mirror image of myself. Every move anticipated, every punch met with an equal counter. The room around us seemed to warp and twist as we fought, the whispers growing louder, urging me to give up. But I couldn't. I wouldn't let this thing take over my life. Summoning every ounce of strength, I pushed it back towards the mirror. It resisted, its hollow eyes filled with rage. With one final effort, I shoved it hard, and it stumbled back into the mirror, its form wavering like a reflection on disturbed water. "No," it screamed, its voice echoing in my mind as the surface of the mirror rippled and then solidified, trapping it on the other side. Panting and shaken, I stared at my reflection, now normal, though my eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion. The restroom was silent once more. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to leave before something else went wrong. I exited the restroom, walking quickly back to the main terminal. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something might still be off. I caught my reflection in a window, and for a moment I saw those hollow eyes again, but they quickly returned to my own familiar gaze. With renewed determination, I made my way through the terminal and out into the open air. The world outside looked the same, but I knew it would take time for me to trust it completely again. I caught a cab home, looking out the window at the familiar streets, trying to convince myself that I was really back. When I arrived at my apartment, I cautiously approached the door. It was closed and locked, just as I had left it. I took a deep breath and entered, half expecting to find my doppelganger waiting for me. But the apartment was empty, and everything was as it should be. I sank onto the couch, exhausted but relieved. My phone buzzed again with a text from Mark. "You okay, man? You seemed really out of it last night." I texted back quickly. "Yeah, just had a rough couple of days. I'll explain later." As I put my phone down, I caught my reflection in the dark screen of the TV. My own eyes stared back at me, tired but familiar. For the first time in what felt like ages, I allowed myself to relax. The ordeal was over, but the memory of that twisted reflection and the bizarre world I had glimpsed would haunt me for a long time. I knew I would always be wary of mirrors and strange restrooms, forever on guard against the whispers and the darkness that lurked just beyond the surface of reality.